My name is Neil Saphir. I'm a member of the History Department faculty and also a faculty fellow here at St. John's College. It's my pleasure very much to welcome you here to what is our second event in an ongoing series called East Meets West here at St. John's College. This series is meant to interrogate the relationship between cultures that have all too frequently been cast simplistically under the rubric of Eastern and Western, categories by which many still organize their most tenacious stereotypes and form an understanding of global politics and cultural values on the world stage. The goal of these talks is not to insist upon the applicability of the monikers East and West, but rather to look for connections, crossings, bridges, and to refute the use of those terms where deemed appropriate. It's an attempt to question historical categories and how they emerged, and to look for methodological answers to these vexing questions of cultural contact and exchange. Finally, it's an attempt to cast UBC's and Vancouver's perch at the edge of one continent, looking across an enormous ocean to another continent in historical and comparative perspective. Some have suggested throwing these categories out altogether, although there's been wild disagreement about what entirely should replace such categories with. What is clear is that these discussions continue to inform our debates and fuel our passions, and for this reason alone deserve a place on our intellectual agenda. Our speaker this afternoon is uniquely suited, I would argue, to discuss these matters with us, not least of all because of the direction in which his own research and writing have taken him in the last few decades. Anthony Pagdens' career has crossed disciplinary and geographical boundaries from its very beginning, as he himself has moved physically and professionally from east to west. Educated at Oxford, where he took his first degree as well as a DPhil in modern history, he moved only slightly east, and this will be the only eastward movement that I will discuss, to take a position at the University of Cambridge, where he was first university lecturer and later university reader in modern intellectual history and a fellow at King's College. In 1997, he accepted the Harry C. Black Professorship in the History Department of the Johns Hopkins University, during which time he was also professorial lecturer in international relations at the School for Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., as well as a visiting member of the Laboratoire d'Anthropologie Sociale at the CNRS in Paris. Most recently, he moved in 2003 to UCLA, where he is currently Distinguished Professor of Political Science and History. He's held visiting posts at the European University Institute in Florence, the Institute for the Humanities at the University of Michigan, and the Department of History at Harvard University, as well as shorter-term posts at the École des Hautes Études in Paris, the University of Aarhus in Denmark, and the University of Santiago de Compostela. His numerous awards included Guggenheim Fellowship and the Eugene Bolton Memorial Prize. And in a rather curious category on his CV, he reveals that he has declined invitations from several prestigious universities, which I will not name, but fortunately for us, he has accepted our invitation to speak today. Apart from these academic accolades, Anthony Pagdens' work has focused, broadly speaking, on the theoretical and political underpinnings of early modern empires and the relationship between Europe and the non-European world during the early modern period, two topics which, of course, also have a lot to say to one another. His first, and what many argue is still his most influential work, was a study of the evolving image of the Amerindian in Europe through the eyes of Spanish and French proto-ethnographers, figures such as Bartolomé de las Casas, which my undergraduates will have heard of, I should hope, otherwise I should be fired, José de Acosta, and Joseph-François Lafitau. The Fall of Natural Man examined the arguments used by early theologians and missionaries to understand the relationship between European ideas about humankind and the native populations being encountered overseas. This account of the origins of comparative ethnology, which was as influential to anthropologists as it was to historians and literary critics, was followed by other equally insightful texts, including Spanish Imperialism and the Political Imagination, European encounters with the New World, and a comparative study of early modern imperial ideologies, lords of all the world. There are some seats right up here if you'd like to come. For the past several years, however, Anthony Pagden has turned his gaze from Europe toward the East. And it is about this most recent project, and arguably his most ambitious project, that he will be talking with us today. Worlds at War, the 2,500-year struggle between East and West, takes us to many of the most controversial and complicated flashpoints of the last 2 millennia of history, from Zeus's mythical rape of Europa to Montesquieu's Persian letters, from Mehmed's conquest of Constantinople to the Allied occupation of Istanbul. Throughout, Anthony Pagden's colorful prose illuminates the protagonists of these histories, while his attention to underlying ideologies and their broader cultural contexts helps his readers situate such exchanges with respect to other events in world history. Like the French philosopher Volney, who sat at the ruins of Palmyra contemplating what caused the rise and fall of civilizations, Anthony Pagden asks us to contemplate the forces by which the East and the West created one another, both in and in contradistinction with their own images of themselves. We ask in the end what remains of the categories East and West when this kind of longue durée history is played out before our eyes in one sweeping and panoramic tale. It's my sincere pleasure and honor then to welcome Anthony Pagden to UBC and to invite you to listen to his discussion of Perpetual Enmity's reflections on 2 millennia of conflict between East and West.
Thank you, Neil. That was very colorful. And I hope my prose will match it. I'm not going to try and dissolve the categories of East and West. What I'm going to try and do is provide you with a brief, selective history of the long-term consequences of those distinctions in the West. Now, it needs hardly to be said, and something that Neil touched upon, that the East-West divide is a very slippery one. Although the division of the worlds into the lands of the rising sun and the lands of the setting sun is supposedly a Syrian invention, the idea that there existed at all a significant cultural and political, possibly even racial distinction between the peoples who inhabited these regions was, until relatively recently, a largely Western conception. And the language we use to spell out these distinctions are not ones that you will find anywhere east of the Bosphorus much before the latter part of the 19th century. So I want to tell the story of how, in a sense, this came about. And the story comes in roughly 2 parts. The first concerns the period from the outbreak of the Persian Wars between 490 and 479 BCE, the wars between Greece and the great mighty Achaemenid Persian Empire, from there until the advent of Islam in the 5th century AD. If you want an initial date for this, it would probably be the years 635, when an Arab army seized the Byzantine city of Damascus, or the battle 2 years later which brought the mighty Sassanid Iranian Empire to an end and introduced Islam into Iran. The second period goes from there, that period in the middle of the 17th century, until the Iraq War, more or less. Now, initially, the East-West divide, or more precisely, the Europe-Asia divide, and by Asia I mean what that term meant in antiquity, that is the lands to the east of the Dardanelles and to the west of the Himalayas. What in the 19th century came to be called the Far East lies outside this frame. And you probably know this whole distinction into near, middle, and Far East is in fact a largely British construction that refers to the location of India. Everything this side, the European side of India, is near and middle. Everything beyond India is far. The this distinction, as you can see, is purely a geographical one. Although the relationships between the scattered city-states of Greece, which until the 5th century was what Greek largely understood by the term Europe, between the Greece and Asia, which meant in effect the Persian Empire, had frequently been hostile before the Persian Wars, they had not involved any sense that a real distinction might exist between these two peoples. The cultures were, to a very great extent, overlapping. It was this wars, a series of conflicts which lasted off and on, as I say, from 490, when the Persian great king King Cyrus had captured the states of Ionia and Caria, until 479 BC, which created what the Greek historian Herodotus called the Perpetual Enmity, hence my title, between East and West, between Greek and Persian, between Europe and Asia. It was these wars, or the aftermath of these wars, which ultimately linked the Persian-Greek dichotomy with another which was to become crucial for the entire history of Europe, namely the distinction between Greeks and later all Europeans on the one hand and the barbarians on the other. It has long been assumed that the Greeks looked upon non-Greeks as barbarous and inferior peoples. And it should be said that that distinction, as with all distinctions, is far more shaded than that. It is true, however, that after the Persian Wars, a genealogy of this conflict between East and West grew up, which would push back from Darius's attempted invasion of Greece in 490, which of course ended in the defeat at the Battle of Marathon, into mythical time and to the Trojan War itself. It is this narrative distinction between East and West, Europe and Asia, which became one not merely between competing forces, but one between different and antithetical ways of life. The origins of this, as I say, we owe largely to Herodotus, who was born in 490 and lived his early life under Persian rule in the then-controlled city of Halikarnassos. It should be said, incidentally, the Persian Empire was not the sort of thing that the British Empire was. It was what anthropologists refer to as a tribute-gathering system, and in fact, the amount of control exercised over the Greek cities under Persian rule was of course, minimal. The story is a complicated one, but in broad outline, the image which emerges from Herodotus himself and subsequent Greek sources divide the inhabited world, the oikomeni, into two opposing groups. On the one hand are the Greeks, who are free and ruled by leaders of their own choosing, and who, though God-fearing, do not confuse the human on the divine. On the other are the barbarians, who are nations of slaves, and who look upon their rulers as divinities. But the most important distinction between the Greeks and the barbarians, and this I maintain will, as you see as go down, is the most important distinction between the East and the West as it unfolds in the Western imagination through time, is their understanding of the law. Now Herodotus tells a story of a Spartan prince, Demaratus, who, having been exiled from Sparta, has joined the Persians in the hope of avenging himself, so he's hardly a loyal patriot. On the eve of the Persian onslaught on Greece, which will lead, of course, eventually to the Battle of Thermopylae, the Persian Emperor Xerxes calls Demaratus and asks him if he thinks that the Greeks will offer any resistance to his massive army. My own belief, said Xerxes, is that all the Greeks and all the other Western peoples gathered together would be insufficient to withstand the attack of my army. Demaratus assures him, however, that the Greeks will fight to the last man. Why, asks Xerxes, given that they have no one to coerce them? The Persians can be whipped into battle or forced to fight from fear of what their commander might do to them if they did not. But the Greeks, they are perfectly free to do as they please. Why should they fight against such overwhelming odds? The Greeks, says Demaratus, are free, yes, but not entirely free, I quote. They have a master, and that master is the law. This they fear far more than Xerxes' subjects fear him. At this extraordinary remark, Xerxes bursts out laughing and good-naturedly lets Demaratus go. Now, there are certainly other distinctions between Greeks and Persians, and what actually of course, Demaratus means by the law in this case is actually the law that obliges you to remain in formation in battle. But the implications of this is the Greeks are simple, honest warriors. The Persians are effete, overly wealthy, deceitful. The Greeks go naked into battle. The effeminate Persians wear trousers and so on. But it is this free enslaved distinction and the fact that the Greeks are governed by the rule of laws, laws which they make, while the Persians and subsequently all barbarians are driven by the will and the whim of one man, which over time will become the most significant difference, not only between Greece and Persia, but by extension between West and East, between Europe and Asia. Now, with the rise of Rome and the Roman occupation of substantial parts of what the Greeks had understood as Asia, from Egypt to Syria, the Carthaginians and then the Parthians largely take the place in the mythic imagination of the Persians. But although the geography changes, the images remain largely stable. All the natural world, declared bluntly the Roman scholar Varro in the 1st century BCE, is divided into earth and air, as all the earth is divided into Asia and Europe. The Romans live, as the Greeks had done before them, by the law. The Asians slave away under one or another kind of theocratic despotism. By the 2nd century AD, when the Greek orator Aelius Aristides could ensure the Roman Emperor Antoninus Pius that Roman law and the Roman constitution, a form of government he enthused, as if it were a mixture of all the constitutions without the bad aspects of any. When this had finally, I quote, granted both to the world and those who live in it a clear and universal from all fear, when at that time the Europe-Asian dichotomy had become the necessary background for the perennial and enduring European belief in the central political value of freedom conceived as liberty under the law. The definitions of both Europe and Asia will change, but the dichotomy between the two will echo down the centuries to feed, among other more or less fanciful images, the 18th century notion of Oriental despotism, Hegel's static East, and Marx's Asiatic mode of production. Now, this imaginary geography becomes slightly less imaginary, and its rhetorical force rather more powerful, with the rise on both sides of the divide of monotheism. After the conversion of Constantine the Great, and more importantly perhaps the Edict of Milan of 313, the Roman Empire became a Christian state. Christianity had never intended to be, and henceforth never would be, a religion of protest or dissent. As that crotchety theologian Tertullian in the 3rd century had warned those Christians who might be tempted to see their faith as a reason for political dissent, this empire, he said, of which you are servants, is a lordship over citizens, not a tyranny. And despite a struggle on the part of the Church to seize effective control over the machinery of the state, at least effective moral control over the machinery of the state, which Pope Benedict XVI is still forlornly pursuing, it has never ever succeeded in exercising more than an indirect, indistinct moral influence, and even that only sporadically, over the essentially secular realm of government, and most importantly, over the formulation and administration of the law. Intrusive prelates could always be reminded of Christ's own injunction to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Christianity, in all its many forms, has always been absorbed by the state. The law has always remained secular, fallible, made by man, and crucially changeable and existential. Jus et factum, as the Roman lawyers insisted. The law was always an expression of fact. On the far side of the Bosphorus, however, things were very different. Byzantium, the Greek-speaking Roman Empire of the East, was far more theocratic than its Western counterpart. But even here, the law, written significantly in Latin, was always the law of the emperor. And it is no accident that the great compilation of Roman laws that we have came out of the East and not the West. It was, however, the arrival of Islam which changed the entire balance between Europe and Asia, however we define it. With the steady rise and astonishing military success of the Arabs, the conflict between Europe and Asia, between West and East, became slowly, inexorably, a struggle over religion. Both religions, of course, claimed exclusive access to the truth. Both believe that in the end of time only one will predominate. And both have, with varying degrees of brutality, insisted that their objective could and should be pursued by force. All of which has helped to obscure the fact that existed other differences, and I would maintain more significant ones, between the two blocs. Differences that were not substantially religious, or rather not doctrinal, but more other cultural and political. Unlike Christianity, Islam took over the state. Indeed, the establishment of the caliphate following Muhammad's death on the 8th of June 632 had effectively created the state. The law is always the expression of God's design. It must therefore be unchanging and resistant to interpretation. And rather than reflect the way things are, as the Romans insisted the law should be, it reflected directly what a sacred text, the Quran, and a set of semi-sacred ones, the hadith or sayings of the Prophet, intended them to be. Of course, in fact, even in the early years, the law, Islamic law, did become, as it had in the West, a matter of interpretation. And of course, the law did change. But for all that, the basis objective of creating a world order based upon divine decree remained unchanged, and for many remains unchanged. The task of the true Muslim, declared the Egyptian Sayyid Qutb, a thinker whose influence over radical Islam has been immense and whose most radical work, Milestones, written in the 1960s, was and remains a bestseller in the Muslim world, was, I quote, to declare the divinity of God alone and then to wrest the power from the hands of the human usurpers and return it to God alone, and to declare the supremacy of divine law alone, and the cancellation of human laws. Now, these discrepancies, however, made very little immediate difference to the balance of power between Christian Europe and Muslim Asia. In fact, if the tyranny of the laws had helped the Greeks defeat the Persians, it did nothing to help the Christians against the Muslims. During most of the period between the mid-7th century and the early 17th, the Islamic world was very much in the ascendant, and by the early 8th century, Islamic forces had overrun Spain and settled as far north as Narbonne in southern Spain. And from then, of course, and I'll come back to this in a minute, until at least the 17th century, it was by no means clear that some or another Muslim power would not eventually seize control of the whole of Europe. It was, however, the Ottomans who lie, in a sense, at the heart of this story rather than the Arab Caliphate. Former warriors from Anatolia who finally posed the greatest threat to the continuing existence of the Western Christian world. And it's with the rise of the Ottomans that the shape of the East-West or Europe-Asia relationships begin to change, and I would maintain it's the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, a story which is often in modern terms thrust somewhat into the background, which provides the key to understanding the relationship between what we now think of as the East and West, which is predominantly Europe and its former overseas settler populations on the one hand, and the Muslim world on the other. Beginning in the early 14th century, the Ottomans moved steadily westwards until in 1453, the Sultan Mehmed II seized Constantine the Great's former capital at Constantinople. Like many such moments, this incident was less momentous and of less lasting significance than it seemed at the time. By the second half of the 15th century, Constantinople, the Rome of the East, all that now remained of the Roman Empire, was a melancholy dying place whose population had shrunk to a mere 100,000 by the end of the 13th century, and by the 15th was shrinking still. But the fall of the golden apple, as the Ottomans called it, carried enormous symbolic force for both sides. The language and literature of the Greeks, wailed the Italian humanist Lauro Quirini, invented with such industry and such labour and perfected over such a long time, has perished, alas, perished. Worse still, the dreaded Turk, the present terror of the world, as one English chronicler called them, were now at the very gates of Western Europe. The whole course of European history since the Trojan War now seemed, at least to the classically minded, to be running in reverse. It seemed that way also, I should say, to the Ottomans. In 1462, Mehmed II, who had read his Herodotus, stood on the supposed site of the Trojan War, where in both his imagination and that of his Western foes it had all begun, and swore that he would make the Christians, the heirs of the Greeks who had burned the topless towers of Ilium, pay, I quote, the right penalty after long period of years for their injustice to us Asiatics at that time, and so often in subsequent times. The Ottoman advance into Eastern Europe and across the Mediterranean seemed unstoppable. Twice, once in 1529 and again in 1684, Ottoman armies laid siege to the city of Vienna, another imperial capital. And although they were repulsed on both occasions, the limits of the empire reached to the shores of the Adriatic in the west, to the Danube-Sava line in the north. And as late as the closing years of the 17th century, as far away as Iceland, Christians prayed to be delivered from the terror of the Turk. No one could be quite certain that, if not they, then their children or their children's children might not end up as subjects of the Sultan. But then, in the 17th century, the balance slowly but inexorably began to change. And with it, when this change took place, the entire perception of what it was that separated Europe from Asia. Now, there are a number of reasons for this shift. And perhaps in this whole history of the relationships between Asia and Europe, this reversal of fortune, as it were, on the part of the Asian world is one of the most difficult to explain. And the factors that led to this shift are, of course, multiple rather than single. But there are a number of factors. The rapid overseas expansion since the 15th century of the European nations, Spain, Portugal, Venice, England, and Holland, had made all of these states incomparably richer than they had been in the 14th, 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. They were also far more consolidated as states than they had been, and far less prone to internal conflict. That is not to say that European powers didn't spend most of their time squabbling and fighting among each other. They continued to do this right down until 1945. But the degree of conflict was far lesser after the 14th, 15th centuries had been before. In addition, a cultural, political, and social revolution overtook Europe between the mid-16th and 17th century, which left the continent changed beyond recognition. Now, the causes with this revolution, or series of revolutions, again, are highly contentious, and they are also many rather than one, and they are also somewhat uncertain. But two events stand out. The first were the wars of religion, the confessional conflicts which followed in the wake of the Reformation in 1519 and tore the continent apart from top to bottom in a series of waves of conflict which lasted down to the famous Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Peace of Westphalia did not in fact bring the conflicts entirely to an end, but it's a convenient terminal date by which at least a common accord was reached between all the major states of Europe. The Treaty of Westphalia is the first treaty in which practically every participant in the conflict, which meant virtually every major state in Europe, actually participated. And was also the first treaty which, for all its shape and form, is essentially medieval, nevertheless led to an attempt to create a lasting settlement. It didn't work as a lasting settlement, but the intention was a lasting settlement. So we have this period of conflict which is then brought to an end, and the result of this was a consolidation of the power of a number of states, and the shift in balance really from the southern European states to the northern European states. The second event, which was crucial, was the discovery of an unknown continent in the Western Hemisphere in 1492. Now, the outcome of both of these, that's to say of the religious conflicts, a struggle which was, of course, guided by and about, if you like, a very large number of different things, but whose content and whose direction was ideological and was supposedly organized into different confessional camps, was about, that's to say, the interpretation of the will of God. The outcome of this was not, as it were, decisive, because what we have as a Christian, we have a Catholic Europe to the south, largely speaking, and a Protestant Europe to the north after 1648, and these divisions have then remained stable from then on in. But wasn't a win for either side, but an increasing skepticism about authority previously ascribed to theology, and particularly to ancient science and ancient philosophy, which had underpinned most theological thinking at the time. In 1835, while trying to explain to his readers the origins of the fledgling United States, Alexis de Tocqueville ascribed the transformation in Europe which would one day produce a democratic revolution in America, and in his view would lead to what he saw as the triumph of democracy throughout the world, ascribed this transformation in Europe to the foundation, I quote, of philosophy properly speaking, abolishing received formulas, destroying the empire of tradition, and overthrowing received opinion. And now this was, as it were, the crux of the matter which led to this revival in learning and the revival of authority that took place after the 17th century. Now, it's a very schematic account, and you find versions of this, I should say, repeated by a number of different writers throughout the 16th and previous to Tocqueville, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. But in essence, Tocqueville was, as in much else, essentially right. In this new world, science and philosophy would not be, as all previous science, or most of it, had been, concern itself with defining received opinion. It would no longer be guided by the church, or rather by theology, nor constrained by the writings of classical antiquity, above all Aristotle, but would deal directly with nature itself. As Galileo flamboyantly put it, 1,000 Demosthenes and 1,000 Aristotles may be routed by the average man who brings nature in. Now, leaving aside the squabbles of historians over the exact nature, origin, significance of what has subsequently come to be called the scientific revolution of the 17th century, these changes led slowly, but inexorably, on the one hand to the consolidation of state power within Europe, and on the other to an immense progress, not only in pure science, but also in technology, and crucially, of course, in military technology. Now, if we move across the Bosphorus to the other side, we see no such phenomenon. The Muslim world, of course, had its own religious wars, namely those between Sunni and Shia between 656 and 681. And while these had also resulted in the emergence of two ideologically hostile power blocs, the Sunni Ottoman state on the one hand, faced with Shia Iran on the other, it had not, as the wars in Europe had done, damaged the status of religion itself. While it would be false to say, as many Western contemporaries did, that the Muslim world was static, it certainly did not experience anything like the rapid changes which occurred in Europe after the 17th century. The great flourishing of Muslim science had taken place in the 12th century, not in the 17th. There was no Descartes or Bacon, no Copernicus or Galileo, no Hobbes, no Locke or Newton, no Pascal or Leibniz in the Muslim world. The revolution in science, however, was also a revolution in technology, and this, together with the increased stability and economic power of the European nations, led to the steady erosion of Muslim, which as far as Europe was concerned meant Ottoman, military success. This came to a head in January the 27th, 1699. The Ottomans were now faced with a relatively new enemy, and paradoxically one which most Europeans had for centuries consigned to the East, namely Russia. The Turk of the North, as the German philosopher Leibniz had called it. But beginning in the 1690s, Peter the Great, the creator of St. Petersburg, began to modernize his state, thus, in the French philosopher Montesquieu's words, giving the customs and manners of Europe to a European power. One aspect of this was the creation of a technologically advanced army and a navy. Peter, incidentally, also even experimented with twin-hulled ships, which he then turned against what he now looked upon as the ancient enemy who had destroyed the Byzantine Empire, which, being Christian and Orthodox, was, of course, seen by Peter and his successors as the antecedent to the Russian Empire. Moscow was the third Rome. There was Rome, there was Constantinople, and now there was Moscow, which would last forever. And if you don't know it, the word Tsar, of course, is a corruption of the Latin word Caesar. On August the 6th, 1696, the Russians seized the Black Sea port at Azov, and the Turks agreed for the first time in their history to discuss peace. In October, representatives of the two sides met at Kalvitz in the Vojvodina, and on January the 26th, 1699, the Sultan Mustafa II agreed to a peace treaty. The Treaty of Karlovitz deprived the Ottomans of territories in Eastern Europe, of all of almost Hungary and Transylvania, which they considered to be not European at all, but Christian. Not European nor Christian, but a fully integrated part of the Dar al-Islam, of the Islamic world. Now, this was the first time in history that the Sultan, the commander of the faithful and heir presumptive of the caliphate, had ever been compelled to sign a treaty with his enemies. By so doing, the Sultan had in effect agreed to abide by the admittedly rough and ready terms of international law as they were understood in the West. It was an unprecedented move for a political and religious culture for which war against all unbelievers was a necessary duty and the permanent obligation of any ruler. Muslims could and did enter into treaties with non-Muslim rulers. These, for the sake of convenience, might last a very long time. But no Muslim ruler could accept a permanent settlement, and the Treaty of Karlovitz was disguised or shaped as a permanent settlement. More than any other previous event, Karlovitz forced upon the Ottomans a new awareness of the potential might of the West and the recognition that if the empire was to survive, it had to adopt new ways of dealing with the house of war, the Dal al-Harb, which would replace simple force by diplomacy. It marked, too, an unmistakable reverse of fortune. Now it would be the West, utterly transformed culturally, religiously, politically and militarily from the squabbling assembly of states which had failed to stop Mehmed and then Suleiman, which would now take the offensive. The Ottomans' response varied over time, but in broad outline, a bid to stop the decline of the empire, successive Ottoman sultans set about trying to change their state to make it more competitive. So long as this meant adopting Western military techniques and to some degree Western administrative measures, this presented little or no difficulty. It soon became clear that importing Western technologies without becoming at least to some degree a Western-style state would be of little effect. Between 1792 then and 93, the Sultan Selim III put in place a series of reforms known collectively and significantly as the Nizam-i-Sedid, the New Order. New regulations were imposed on provincial governors, on taxation, and on the control of the grain trade in an attempt to modernize the economy of the empire and reverse the slow disintegrating hold the Sultan had over the provinces. Most radical of all, however, was the creation of a new military and naval schools, teaching not only the rudiments of Western techniques of gunnery, fortification, and navigation, but also Western science required to master them. These schools were staffed by French officers, and French was made a compulsory language for all students. In defiance of the general Islamic injunction against all forms of non-Islamic learning and non-Islamic writings, these schools were provided with a library of some 4,000 European books, which included a copy of the Encyclopédie, a work which conservative Muslims found quite as offensive as conservative Christians. The new order, however, proved to be more than the old order, in particular the Janissary Court, could tolerate. And in the summer of 1806, a series of uprisings against Selim's reforms spread to Istanbul. Angry and devout Muslims rode up, in the words of the imperial and deeply conservative chronicle Ahmed Asim Effendi, to resist, I quote, the malicious crew and abominable band of the Franks, who by incensement and seduction to their ways of thought had brought, and this is important, to undermine the principles of the holy laws. There's always this emphasis on what is actually at stake here is the undermining of the law. Within a year, the forces of reaction had won, and on May the 28th, 1807, Selim III was deposed. But this, in fact, was only the beginning. In 1839, Sultan Abdul Mesid I inaugurated what came to be called, famously, the Tanzimat, or reordering. Cautiously, the word suggested that all that was attempted was a rearranging, a reinvigorating of old ways. In fact, however, it was to go a long way, the Tanzimat, but on either Mahmud's reforms or Selim's aborted new order. Those had confined themselves to changing the way the existing institutions operated, but they had left most of those institutions, with the notable exception of the armed forces, largely unaltered. The Tanzimat, however, was aimed at the very heart of Ottoman Islamic society. For at its core lay a wide-ranging radical attempt to replace the Islamic system of law, which resulted in a significant and still only partial secularization of the entire society. A decree called the Noble Rescript of the Rose Chamber, which was issued on November the 13th, 1839, contained a number of concepts hitherto unknown in Ottoman law. the principles, if not quite rights, of life, dignity and property of the subject, and of a fair and public trial for all. The following year, a new penal code was introduced which claimed to offer to the shepherd in the mountains and the minister, or though not quite yet the Sultan himself, equality before the law. Most controversial of all, it established the principles of equality of all religions, thus in effect abolishing the privileged fiscal and legal position to which all Muslims believe themselves entitled. The culmination was the creation, for the first time in any Islamic state, of a code of civil law, although it would take nearly 40 years before it was completed. The Noble Rescript was also radical in another way. It openly acknowledged these principles as innovations. Innovation in traditional Muslim usage was the converse, of course, of Sunnah, the way of the Prophet. The worst, quote, the worst things are those that are novelties, runs one of the hadith. Every novelty is an innovation, every innovation is an error, and every error leads to hellfire. Most previous reforms, with the exception of Selim's short-lived New Order, have been disguised as best they could as a return to older, now corrupted ways. Not so the Rescript. For many Muslims, it was a direct affront to religion, an act of heresy. Now, the Tanzimat implied a cleavage between justice and thus also politics and religion. It was, in fact, a violation of the most sacred tenet in Islam, that the law is and can only be the commands of God as transmitted to mankind by the last of his prophets. In 1841, the minister Mustafa Reshid Pasha introduced the new commercial code, derived almost entirely from French models. He was asked by the members of the ulema, the clergy, so to speak, the clergy's high command, if this was in conformity with the holy law. The holy law has nothing to do with the matter, he replied. Blasphemy, shouted the ulema. The ensuing uproar forced the Sultan to dismiss Reshid Pasha, though he was later reinstated as Minister of Foreign Affairs. The process of reform was briefly arrested, but it could not be halted. In 1847, mixed civil and criminal courts were created with an equal number of European and Ottoman judges and bound by rules of evidence and procedure drawn from European, not Islamic practices. Now, the administration of the law was not all that was being slowly prized away from the ulema. So too was education. A number of schools were created in 1846, and although they provided for instruction in the duties and obligation which religion imposes upon man, it was clear that they were preparing the way for the eventual introduction of a wholly secular system of education, which came progressively from 1868 until 1900. Now, the most immediate and ultimately devastating effect of this was, of course, to alienate a large number of the Sultan's former subjects. The most significant of this was an uprising which began in 1792 in Saudi Arabia, when a group of people under the religious leader Muhammad ibn Abdul al-Wahhab, who began preaching an extreme form of Islamic Puritanism, which still has, of course, a tremendous impact in the Middle East today, and was supported by a powerful tribal leader called Abd al-Aziz bin Muhammad ibn Saud, who was, of course, the founder of the Saud dynasty that still rules Saudi Arabia to this day. And this uprising lent effectively to the first defection of what was a relatively insignificant part of the Ottoman Empire from the point of view, military and economic point of view, which was, of course, an enormously significant one from religious and political point of view. Ultimately, what this reform meant was, in fact, the steady collapse of the Islamic Empire altogether. The Ottoman state became in rapid succession first an autocratic monarchy, then briefly a constitutional monarchy, and finally an autocratic military, secular and de-Islamicized republic. This is this republic, modern Turkey, which has become the most westernized state in the Islamic world, to the point where it's been able to witness the election of an Islamic government, self-conscious government, which has made no attempt, so far at least, to dismantle its institutions or to challenge the secular principles on which it is based. The former terror of the world, the scourge of Christianity, is now begging for entry into the European Union. The most secular, most Western, in that it has been constituted on the basis of a legal consensus. It's a political experiment since at least the creation of the United States. Now, of course, the demise of the Ottoman Empire, its transformation into the modern Turkish Republic, is not only the story of attempted westernization, it is also, of course, the story of Western imperialism. To put it bluntly and briefly, the Ottomans backed the wrong side in the First World War. It's putting it very briefly and bluntly, but the final overthrow of the empire was more than the defeat of one of Germany's allies. When on November the 13th, 1918, a British army, followed soon by French and Italian allies, entered the city of Istanbul, the occupation was greeted as the final collapse of the East. As Winston Churchill had said somewhat wistfully 3 years earlier at the height of the disastrous Gallipoli campaign, when everything seemed to be going in the Ottoman direction, think what Constantinople is to the East. It is more than London, Paris and Berlin all rolled into one is for the West. Think how it has dominated the East. Think what its fall will mean. In fact, its fall meant two things. For true believers, fundamentalists if you will, such as Sayyid Qutb, it meant, along with the subsequent creation of the Arab states created after 1918, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon and Jordan, nominally independent but in fact under European control and modelled after European monarchies, and not to mention, of course, the creation of the State of Israel, not exactly created by the Allies, at least wished into being and supported by them. It was a lesson as to where westernization would eventually lead. To another group of modernizers, on the other hand, the Arab nationalists, of whom the Egyptian leader Nasser was briefly the most encouraging, who ousted the Europeans from much of the Middle East after 1945, Turkey was a proof that an Islamic state could be transformed into a modern industrial nation. True, none of the Arab nationalist movements were ever as ferociously anti-Islamic as Ataturk, the founder of the modern Turkish state, had been. But they were no less determined to create states with essentially secular constitutions ruled according to secular laws. The ultimate failure of Arab nationalism, its decline into factionalism, and its apparent impotency in the face of Israel seemed to many, as it had done to the Ottoman ulema in 1841, the inevitable outcome of the reckless abandonment of the true faith. What was now required, argued Qutb, who was executed by Nasser in 1966, was a new Quranic generation to somehow replicate the companions of the Prophet and rebuild Islam out of the ruins of Western nationalism, just as Muhammad had created the first Ummah out of the ruins of Arab paganism. To achieve this, it would be necessary to return to a pure understanding of the original sources, the Quran itself and the Hadith, and, I quote, the biography of the Apostle and his exemplary actions. The task of this new Quranic generation, he went on, was to declare the divinity of God alone, quote, to wrest the power from the hands of the human usurpers, to return it to God alone, and to declare, again, the supremacy of divine law alone and the cancellation of human laws. This was to be the base of the Islamic resurgence, the Ba'ath. It would take time, he recognized, for the new Islamic generation to reach the levels of material and scientific success attained by the West. There was no hostility to those, I should say, levels of scientific and material success. He fully recognizes their value and desirability. It would take time to reach this level, but he insisted it would happen. The difference between the revival of Islam and world leadership may be vast, and there may be many difficulties on the way, but the first step must be taken for the revival of Islam. It is on this simple claim that the modern jihadist, fundamentalist, Islamicist, whatever you want to call them, movements, and the Islamic governments which tacitly support them is ultimately based. Always the cry is the same. The abiding sin of the West and its supporters has been to replace divine command by human law. It's not that it's Christian, it's not that it's technologically successful, it is that it has forsaken the law of God for that of man. In a letter to America, distributed via the internet on November 2002, and attributed, possibly falsely, to Osama bin Laden, the major crime of which the United States is accused is precisely the separation of the secular from the sacred. You are the nation, it ran, who rather than ruling by the Sharia of Allah in its constitution and laws, chose to invent your own laws as you will and desire. You separate religion from your politics, creating the pure nature which affirms absolute authority to the Lord your Creator. You are the worst civilization witnessed by the history of mankind. On these grounds, there can be no reconciliation between what is generally called the West, both now in the West and the East, a term which now applies not so much to Christians, but to secularists, and above all to the secular ideals of Western liberal democracy. No reconciliation between these people and the Muslim world. Of course, the realities, as we all know, are very different in many places. Many modern Muslim states are governed in essence by legal systems which are secular and Western in inspiration. Few of them, however, pay much heed to the shibboleths of Western international relations, democracy and human rights, and everyday social relations are bound, if not directly by the Sharia, at least by customs which derive from it. Yet for all that, they hardly live up to Qutb or bin Laden's expectations and hopes. For most peoples, shared by both the insistence shared by both Western intellectuals and a large number of Muslims that Islam is essentially a religion of peace, that both sides share common cultural grounds, and that the long-standing enmity, the perpetual enmity between the secular West and the Islamic world, can be resolved by dialogue, by mutual respect and understanding, amounts to nothing more than yet another form of Westernization. All these people, Maulana Abdullah Maududi, one of the founders of the Islamic Society in what was then India in 1941, and again one of the revered teachers of the modern Islamicists. All these people, in their misinformed and misguided zeal to serve what they hold to be the cause of Islam, are always at great pains to prove that Islam contains within itself the elements of all types of contemporary and social political thought and action. Unquote. But this, he insisted, was an absurdity which derived not from conviction but from an inferior complex which had led his fellow Muslims to believe, I quote, "We can earn no honor or respect unless we are able to show that our religion resembles modern creeds and in its agreement with most contemporary ideologies." In a more strident view yet, the Imam Khadim al-Abda al-Nasari told his congregation in Baghdad in May 2003, "The West wants you to distract you with shiny slogans like freedom, democracy, culture and civil society. Do not listen to them," he cried, "for infidel corruption has entered our society through these concepts." This did not mean rejecting Western democracy as such, if all that was to be understood, was the popular and elective government of the kind which was widely believed to have existed at Medina during the life of the Prophet. What it meant was rejecting precisely the Western secularism which had accompanied, and in the eyes of most Muslims had been largely the consequence rather than condition, of the creation of modern liberal democratic states. All that meant in effect, rejecting what is after all the basic premises of all forms of democracy, modern and ancient, that sovereignty lies with the people and not, as it must do in Islam, with God. The future Islamic state of Maududi's imagination was to be based upon a duly elected leadership, but it was to be bound not by the laws which that leadership might make, but only by the laws of God. He called this a God-worshipping democratic caliphate, a theo-democracy. What he had in mind, of course, was not something unlike what the modern Republic of Iran has in fact become. And this, I would contend, is where we find ourselves today. In the complex realities of the standoff between the Islamic world and the West, things are not, of course, as stark as the Islamicists would all have us believe. Turkey is the most successful modern state whose population is predominantly Muslim, but whose constitution, as I said, is secular. But it cannot be doubted that most of the others, Tunisia, Morocco, Indonesia, Algeria, Egypt, Pakistan, are under constant threat from powerful and generally widely supported Islamicist movements, which makes their governments unstable, sometimes tyrannical, often ineffectual. Not to mention the truly theocratic state of Iran and possibly in the not-so-distant future, Iraq, and neo-theocratic states such as Saudi Arabia. So, here we stand at an impasse. There is, for better or for worse, only one kind of modernity, and for better or for worse, it has dominated the planet in one way or another for the past 2 centuries. It can accommodate religious beliefs of all kinds. It can, as the case of China has demonstrated, also tolerate all kinds of unfreedom, something which the heirs of Max Weber and the champions of the civilizing power of universal capitalism have found hard to stomach. But it is and must be itself secular, above and beyond all belief in any kind of determinate being. You can, of course, live in the kind of world the Taliban or bin Laden seem to want, but you can only do so either by returning to the Stone Age or, as the Taliban and their like actually do, living as parasites on Western science and Western technology. Thank you.
Okay, well, we have time for questions, comments, objections, criticisms, suggestions, and conversation. And I should also say
in that order.
And?
In that order.
In that order, necessarily. I should also say that after the question and answer session, we'll have a small reception, and you're all invited to stay around for that. Hopefully the reception will arrive before the end of our discussion section. So, who would like to begin? And I'm going to pass this around so that because we're
Tim Brooke, the Department of History. You end on a very strong statement. 10 years ago, roughly, there was a discussion about alternative modernities. And I'm wondering what you think of that. Is it a sort of a hopelessly ideological attempt to evade the nature of modernity?
I'd have to answer yes, wouldn't I? I'm not sure. I've just got involved, I should say, just about a footnote. I'm currently involved in a sort of blog debate in something called the Cato Institute in Washington about the nature of modernity. And the more that this topic gets bandied backwards and forwards, the less I'm inclined to believe there is such a thing. There's a sort of sense that somehow around about anywhere between 1790 and 1890, the world was transformed, and that without any foreseeable, very, very obvious precedences to it. So maybe modernity is the wrong term to be using in the end. It's simply that what I think one witnesses is inevitably what used to be called the rise of the West, however you want to interpret that. The technological, political success of a group of states which all, not necessarily in concordance with one another, not even in cooperation always with one another, but which generally by and large, usually in cooperation with one another, had similar kinds of political systems, and as a consequence of those sorts of political systems and the coordination it allowed them, were able to dominate in different ways and for various ends large areas of the planet. I don't see that there's any persuasive alternative to that, if that is what modernity is, which is what generally thought to be industrial revolution, etc., etc. So I suppose I would have to say that I've yet to be persuaded there's an alternative. There's an alternative history. This is not, of course, to say that there aren't other regions of the world. China is obviously a clear case in point, who have different histories which interlock with this, and interlock with this to a certain point, which are alternative in that sense, in being very different from your Chinese historiography. So, and so I recognize that China was left out of this account because it really doesn't which is why we started with this caveat that we're talking about Asia in the ancient sense, and this sense that there's a continuity down through time, which is a Western conception of how these continuities go. That concept of continuity, which to a certain degree has dropped out of the perception, but was very, very strong, for instance, in the 19th century, and that what we're dealing with as a continuing process over time is very much confined, I think, to the west of the Himalayas, except towards the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. Hegel starts speaking about China as they were part of the same process. And of course, there's a Western incursions into China in the 19th century. So I suppose you could be, I'm quite prepared to accept, in my ignorance, because it is a question of that there's an alternative Chinese modernity, if you like, which grows up simultaneously, but in a very, very different sorts of direction with that of the West. That I would that I would be. But as far as this story is concerned, which is one of enmity, of conflict, which really doesn't really let up. And it's merely a series of accidents in the sense that it should be so. I mean, it's not that accidents are wrong, but it's a series of historical contingencies that it should be so, rather than, which I'm not suggesting, there's an ideological continuation between the Persian wars and the wars against the Turk, although it's often couched in those terms by later generations of historians in the West. It's certainly not thought of in those terms in the East. The only people who really see any real link between classical antiquity and the modern world are the Ottomans. But then they're very much schooled in that way of thinking. So I think that, and this is central why the Ottomans are central to my story. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I would, as far as this story is concerned, I don't think there are alternative modernists. I stand to be persuaded. I mean, I would like to know where they're coming from. Yes.
State my name and where I'm from. Oh, okay. Pardon. Tom Piotto, history PhD student. My only question is, and this is actually sort of a mild objection, is that what I think could have perhaps been mentioned is the greater capacity historically and today of heterodox interpretations within the Islamic world, particularly the farther east one goes. And I refer specifically to the historic decentralization of the clergy, which, of course, the Wahhabis currently are really trying hard to combat. But the greater capacity in the Islamic world, because the lacking of, say, the great metropoles of religion in Rome or historically Constantinople or the Third Rome, the greater prevalence of, for instance, syncretist folk Islam or much more laid-back interpretations of holy law. I actually remember a friend of mine who is Iraqi explained to me that I'm not sure if this is the normative Iraqi folk Islam, but there are deliberate misinterpretations of the passage regarding consumption of wine or beer. The argument being made, well, date wine doesn't come from grapes or wheat, so it's okay. I leave that question open, although I don't think it was really a well-phrased question. My apologies.
Yes, I mean, of course, there are all sorts of divergences on both sides. I mean, it's a very, very schematic overview, and I agree with you. And I wanted to focus on where the centers of what to me is the centers of power. Hence, the importance of the Ottoman Empire, I think, which is in this story is often left out. And of course, it's I mean, the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, particularly in its relationships to the so-called the West, and in particular with regard to how the political structure is organized around the notion of a theocratic or semi-theocratic state. This is not to say at all that there aren't enormous divergences. And then I tried to suggest at the end that there are all kinds of possible futures that might be, and I think Turkey is evidence of this, that might perfectly well have a form of secularized government, if you like, which on the one hand is also capable of accommodating a large religious population. I think there is, however, a real conflict in that, unlike Christianity, which was forced to surrender its grasp or potential, after its attempt to seize control of the state, because it was a battle which it lost essentially over time. Islam never found itself in that position within the Ottoman world in the 19th century and lost the battle. Okay, and very similar to the ways that it lost the battle in the West. So you have created a secularized state in Turkey, but the long-term consequences of those have been very different from the ways in which it was in the West. But this is not to claim that there is a monolithic Islamic world at all.
Okay, I just have one last question, and I apologize if I in any way put that word monolithic in. Could we look at then, say, the historic, if we are to look at a West versus East governmental distinction, could we say that the Roman tradition of a military establishment holding a religious establishment sort of at a constant agonism versus a survival of the Persian method, the Persian style of government of a tributary state. And I realize that is an extremely broad category in and of itself. Not really easy to well.
Could we just say what was the end? Sorry, what
the survival of a multi-ethnic, multilinguistic tributary state ruled from a metropole.
Sorry, I'm not sure what the Can we see the survival of that? Yes.
Yes. Yeah, the Islamic model of statecraft historically.
Well, the thing is, what happens with then, of course, as far as the Ottoman world is concerned, that's destroyed in the Second World War, First World War. So after the Paris Peace Conference, you have this state is then carved up into these separate states, which are, you take various, what were in fact then 3 districts of the Ottoman Empire and make it into a kingdom which you then call Iraq. Right? So you have these, I mean, it has an earlier history, but the immediate history, and certainly the history for those people who were living in it in 1980 or 1919, was that it was a district of the Ottoman Empire. So that and the whole of the millet system, which then, of course, slowly collapses as a result of the various bits of the Ottoman Empire being peeled away, starting with the Greek revolt in the 19th century and so on. So that I think that this whole system, which worked in a sort of more or less functional way, worked extremely well, of course, throughout the 17th and part of the 18th century, but began to succumb to pressure in the 19th, because a lot of it's internal as well as external. The collapse is partly due to internal confusion of one sort or another. This then begins to fall apart. Now, what you refer to as the Roman model, of course, get transmuted into the nation state. And then you have the attempt to shift that, which is a Western attempt, of course, to impose that model upon the Middle East, which is where we find ourselves today. The exportation of nations to areas of the world where nationhood was not, or the concept of nationhood was not the norm. The former Ottoman world, most of Africa and so on, is, of course, one of the causes of this, the essential difficulty which those areas have in, conforming to the expectations of the so-called international community. So I think if the question is that model fails ultimately, but it fails under pressure, so to speak. It's destroyed, if you like, from the outcome. It hasn't been. There's no sense that there's any been attempt made to resuscitate it.
Hector Williams, Classical Near Eastern and Religious Studies, UBC. About a year ago, I was in Timbuktu in Mali, and it looked very much as if there were a new front opening up in sub-Saharan Africa in the whole question of Islamic Western confrontation. And do you think that the West creates boogeymen like Afghanistan and Iraq and now sub-Saharan Africa? The Pentagon in September of last year set up a sub-Saharan desk because of concerns with al-Qaeda infiltrating a band from Mauritania in the west to Sudan in the east.
Well, they're fairly powerful bogeymen, aren't they? I mean, they're not in fictions. I mean, if you think about Afghanistan, seems to be just a continuing process of poor intelligence and poor military operations and so on. I mean, you have this idea that starts that this is what was responsible for 9/11, and then this is the area which harbored al-Qaeda. You go and destabilize, well, it was pretty much destabilized anyway, but you further destabilize the state. You then don't, this seems to me this is getting to a different area of discussion, but then what you don't do is make any real effort to rebuild it. You may remember at the beginning of the so-called war on terrorism, there's a great deal of talk about the Marshall Plan as being a model. And this talk, we probably don't remember, but now it's so long ago, but that talk was soon dropped. The Marshall Plan being I suppose, the only really successful piece of American foreign policy in the 20th century. And that then, that if there had been a Marshall Plan for the Middle East, if there had been, really attempt to create schools and hospitals and infrastructure, then things might have been, rather than just putting more and more troops on the ground, then something substantial might have been developed from that. But I don't know about how much bogeyman it is. I mean, it's concerned about how serious, in that case, what your take is on the so-called war on terror, because it seems on the face of it to be an absurd conception. You can't fight a war against terror to start with, and it's not a single entity, and it makes people feel good, perhaps, particularly in the wake of a devastating attack. There's something they can get at. There's an enemy that they can find. But once the comforting effect of that has worn off, then it seems it's as an operational model, it can only lead to disaster. So you're right that in that sense you set up a sub-Saharan desk. I didn't know about this, incidentally, but I mean, you set up a sub-Saharan desk because you see that there's some potential threat from an organization which seems to be enormously diminished in force, and whose capacity for operation seems to be getting smaller and smaller all the time. I may be quite wrong about that. I may be disproved by that tomorrow. But it does seem to me that the threat is much, much, much less than it was, and that, if anything, the policy should be to strengthen those Islamic states who look as though they have a chance of surviving, as something more along the Turkish line, the Turkish model, than simply, as it were, trying to find out where the next pocket of the insurgency might be. But I'm not sure that it's an entirely false notion. What I do think is that the responses have yet, the sensible response of the West, so to speak, have yet to be worked out in such a way as to be at all effective.
I have a criticism. I have a criticism and a question. Well, my criticism is really a criticism. Well, you seem to focus much more on what Sayyid Qutb says in the 20th century, and about how he was like an expression of Islamism. And I think that well, this actually ties into my question. He wasn't really in the bestseller list until some years after his death, I think. So,
but he was banned for a long time because he was.
My question is Islamism in the 20th century primarily an expression of antagonism to perceived imperialism? Because I think a good example is the Palestinian militia groups. They were almost all Marxist-Leninist, and now Hamas, I think, is the more prominent of them. And also, going back 50 years into the Middle East, most governments have either a very strong leftist tendency or a very strong leftist tendency in the public mood. So I was just asking, don't you think that Islamism can be explained not as a confrontation, not as a confrontation to the West, but just an alternative route to Marxism?
Well, I agree with you, absolutely. But the point there is that the Marxism is precisely interpreted as being an expression of the West. I think that what we find is that the story, which I didn't really set out, only touched on, and I didn't do it with any great clarity, is that what you find is the Arab nationalist movements, right, of which Nasser is the most prominent, which are backed by the Soviet Union, and the neo-Marxist or neo-Marxist affiliates fail. And the failure of those, I mean, I have quotations in my mind, is seen as a failure of a response to Western imperialism. Obviously, I'm not disputing that for a minute, that this is seen as, this is the face of the Western imperial movement after the end of the First World War, the attempt to carve up the Middle East between largely France and Britain. the response to that is nationalist and Marxist, and those two things ultimately fail. What they result in is a constant, because I haven't touched really upon the State of Israel, but a constant failure to defeat and turn back the State of Israel, so that what you find is a return to, and you're quite right about Qutab, comes in as an alternative later, when those movements, particularly the one that executed him, are seen as having been destroyed. So I think it is a response to the West, because quite rightly these people see that Marxism is not, because we have this curious way of talking about East and West in the West, so to speak, as being the Soviet Union on the one hand. So you see Marxism as being a kind of Eastern phenomenon, because it's not at all. It's an outburst of a Western socioeconomic way of thinking, and this is precisely the objection that we need to, I'm saying these more extreme Islamist movements, think of it as we need to purify ourselves, not merely of slavish adaptations of liberal democracy as an expression of Western, but also of Marxist, one or another form of Marxism as an expression of the West. So I still think that there's the same core, the core remains the same. Now, of course, when I do want to highlight the fact that I know perfectly well that the vast majority of Muslims anywhere in the world are not Islamicists. Right? I'm talking about this particular group and these particular movements, which are extremely powerful and important, but they don't represent the mass of opinion among people. It's perfectly possible for to Muslim communities to exist side by side with Western ones in perfect harmony. I'm not suggesting that is not my conflict at all. What I'm suggesting is that the ideology of these is a Western anti-Western ideology.
I'm not suggesting that you're suggesting.
No, right.
I'm just just trying to just look at it from an alternative view and just
Yeah, no, I would have thought that there isn't. I mean, I'm sure there are alternative views, but I mean, what I'm saying is that the fact that some of these movements are left wing. The Arab nationalist movements are extremely left-orientated, is not something which is seen by the Islamicists as being necessarily in their favor.
Yes, Mark Vesey, Department of English. You've just touched upon one West within the West, which we on other occasions might call an East. I'm interested in another West within the West. The West that is further west than other parts of the West with respect to Constantinople, which was the place where the twain generally parted in your account. You quoted the Italian humanist who, on the occasion of the sack of Constantinople, lamented the loss of, in effect, ancient pagan classical Greek culture. Didn't remark, at least then, on the loss of a contemporary Christian imperial capital. And it strikes me that Italian humanist reaction reflects a particular kind of Western sense of the West. And I'm just wondering if I've heard you right in as much as the particular separation of the secular from the divine that is the fatal flaw of the West from the point of view of one Eastern perspective, is particularly the fault of, or to the credit of, this Western West within the West, the part that doesn't, as it were, go to Byzantium. Because, as you pointed out, Byzantium, at least as Justinian imagined affairs, was going to be pretty theocratic. I mean, the Justinianic code, in Justinian's mind, is actually something divinely inspired.
It is, but don't forget the legislator is still well, there are two answers to the immediate last part. The legislator is still the emperor. He's still a human being. He is imperator legibus solutus. He is the man whose legislation is unchained, unfettered by other considerations, including, of course, by the church. So, although it's true that Byzantium is a far more theocratic state, and the Theodosian code is much more of a semi-theocratic code of law than the Justinian's codes are. Wouldn't you agree?
Well,
Yeah. Anyway,
I'd
but
love
the
to
thing is
discuss
that
that.
there is the law, and then of course there's the Roman law is the interpretation of the Roman laws that insist all the time upon what it means to be a secular code, which is that it's essentially existential. You know, it recognizes what is fact and therefore also subject to change. So that although there's a moral underpinning, and that moral underpinning obviously comes from the divinity. There's no dispute about that. And there's a close relationship between the law faculties and medieval universities and as I needly hardly tell you, between them and the law faculties. Nevertheless, it remains the case that the concept of what the law is in the thinking of the Roman lawyers is essentially a secular affair. So I think that whereas it is true that the Byzantine case is, and it's true that the lamentation for the fall of Constantinople is the lamentation essentially for the fall of classical antiquity rather than the fall of the Byzantine world, because, as you know, there's this long history of conflict with the Byzantine world which lies at the back of that, which is, of course, partly responsible for the fall of Constantinople anyway, or the failure of the West to respond to the pleas for help from Constantinople. So there is that ambiguity about it. I still think that what is really significant about this conception of the law remains a classical Roman one, even though it's passed through this more theocratic.
It must still be important that the Western colonial powers are from, as it were, 1492 onwards, are for the most part nation-states from the Western part.
Oh, from the Western part, yes. Yeah. No. I mean, they're the ones that... But don't forget, the law that they're... The basis, the fundamental... I mean, the laws that they're embracing, of course, are multiple because a great many of them come from... have Germanic origins rather than Roman origins. But the idea, Burke's idea of, that what the law of Europe is Germanic law tamed by Roman law. That concept is and Germanic law is very clearly something that's separated out and distinct from any interpretation any interference from gods of one sort or another. That is what underpins the culture of Europe. The various, as he calls it, the one great republic of Europe is based upon this common ascription. That is what keeps Europe together. That is what identifies Europe as opposed to somewhere else. And that, that and Christianity, but Christianity doesn't play that much of a role at this stage because we have more than one Christianity, at least. But we have essentially a single jurisprudence if we don't have a single set of laws, clearly, but we do have a single jurisprudence. And the crucial thing about that is that it's entirely in the hands of human beings and not in the hands of God.
Any other questions or comments? If not, please join me in thanking Anthony Pagden for coming here and giving us a stimulating discussion, and join us afterwards for drink, cheese, and water, or whatever else you'd like to have. So, thank you.